Hello everyone. I hope you are keeping indoors and keeping yourself safe. So we'll be continuing with our chapter, The Story of an Hour. Before we move on with the second edition, let's just have a quick recap of what we have read in the previous video. So we have seen that the protagonist of the story, Mrs. Mallard, has lost her husband, and this news was conveyed to her by her sister Josephine and her husband's friend Richards. Now they conveyed the message very gently to her because Mrs. Mallard is known to have a weak heart, and everyone expected Mrs. Mallard to not accept the fact and be very be in a numb state. But then to the contrary to their imaginations, Mrs. Mallard accepted the fact very soon, and she cried her heart out in her sister's arms, and then she decides to move on to her room, and she did not want anyone else to follow her to her room. So we will be continuing after this. This is page number 54, paragraph 4. We will be starting with paragraph 4. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. Now from here we need to be conscious about the words, the key words, and we need to see, because from here we are going to start with the stream of consciousness style. So I would request you to underline certain words which I am going to repeat. In this paragraph you will be underlining open window, comfortable roomy armchair. So these two words you have to underline. So once we move ahead and we move ahead in the story, then we will come back and understand what these words actually symbolized when Kate Chopin used these words in the paragraph. So she sat down in an armchair, which was a comfortable armchair, and in front of her there was an open window. And she was physically very exhausted, and that exhaustion was reaching onto her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. Now in front of her there was an open window, and through that open window she could see an open square in front of her house, and from that window she could also see the tops of some trees which were alive with newly found leaves, newly formed flowers, which were depicting the spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air, and you must all have smelled the smell of mud when the first drizzle, when the first few drops of rain falls on the earth, and you all know it's such a delicious smell. It brings out the smell of new life, and it actually washes away all the dryness of the summer. So this is a delicious smell that Kate Chopin is explaining over here. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares, and from the street below she could hear the sound of a seller, a peddler who was selling his ware. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her family, and there was also the sound of a song which was sung from somewhere very far off. Someone was singing a song, and that song could also reach her. Very slight sound, very meek sound could reach her through the open window, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves, and there was countless sparrows. There were many sparrows which were actually twittering, which were actually fluttering their wings through the window sills, through the roofs of the houses, outside on the trees. There were so many birds which were fluttering, and she could hear the sound of their sweet chirping. So now you could see there are certain words like, open square, new spring life, then delicious breath of air, then you have the distant note of the song, peddler crying his wares, then the twittering of sparrows. All these words you need to underline. These are some of the key words. You can see that they are talking, also representing the various senses that we have in our. You could see that there's a the visual sense is also used. You could see that the auditory, the smelling sense is also used. You could see the olfactory sense, the smelling sense is also used. The auditory sense of hearing is also used over here. So all the senses were all senses were being used over here. Now why this was used, we will find out, come to know a little bit later. There was patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. And outside her window she could also see patches of blue sky through the clouds. Now if you have seen a sky after a rain, then you will understand this, that the clouds are all patched up together, and through that it's there are certain clearings which clears out, and you could see blue sky which is there. So this was also, certain patches of blue sky could also be seen amidst the cloud which was there in the sky, and through her open window she could see this. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her as a child. And she just sat back onto her armchair, onto the cushion of her armchair, very motionless. And the only time she moved was when a slight sob escaped her, like a small child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. Like a small child. If you have seen a small child who has cried before sleeping, now when the child is sleeping, it still sobs in the sleep as if it is dreaming of crying. So the same way, she had already cried, and the only thing was the small sobs which were escaping her in between, which was coming out, and that was the only movement that was there. Otherwise she was completely motionless. Now we have the physical description of the protagonist, Mrs. Mallard. She was young, with a fair, calm face. She was not old. She was a young lady with a she was very fair, and she had a very calm and quiet face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. And the lines on her face, it spoke about her repression. She was controlling her emotions since a long time. Maybe all her emotions were controlled. She was not a person who used to show out her emotions very soon. She used to control, suppress her emotions, and even a certain strength. And she had a certain strength. That face could show a certain strength which was there inside her. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes. But now there was only a dull stare. She was looking at something continuously, and it was very dull. Only that could be seen in her face, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. And the gaze was fixed on the blue sky which was beyond the clouds, the blue sky which was there, her gaze was fixed on those patches of blue sky. Yonder, yonder means over there. It is an archaic English terminology, that is old English usage, which was used in the olden times, which meant over there. It was not a glance of reflection. Now, this is very important. It was not a glance of reflection. Reflection is when you're thinking about something, when you are trying to analyze something. But this was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. But it rather showed that she had stopped thinking anything intelligently. She was not thinking anything intelligently at that moment. Nothing was very clear in her mind at that moment. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. There was something which was coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. She was not eagerly waiting for it. There was a thought which was coming to her, but that thought was actually scaring her. She was scared to get that thought onto her. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. So the thought was very soft and subtle and very elusive. It was something which was, difficult to catch. It was something which was difficult to understand or define. So it was not something which was very clear, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now you see all the things that was reflected through the open window, it was symbolizing the thought which was coming to her. It was creeping out of the sky, out of the cloud. It was coming out. The thought was coming out as if, and through all the sounds that she heard, the sound of the person singing a song, or the peddler selling his wares, the scent of the fresh mud after the rain, the colors that she saw, the blue sky, or the green trees, the new leaves, spring life, the colors that filled the air, everything reflected upon the thought which was coming onto her mind. So today, in this session, we will end it over here, and in the next session we will come to know what exactly was coming on to Mrs. Mallard's mind. Till then, read the story once again and be ready for the next session. Bye bye.